To the Tuscaloosa News and Tidesports.com. Cecil, is it bad that when I hear that song, I think more about college football recruiting or recruiting in general than I do perhaps, say, relationships? Is there something to glean from that, Cecil?
No, it's almost signing day. It's like you think Christmas carols in December. February, you think recruiting songs.
Yeah, little commitment songs for you on the eve of NSD 2000. Well, what about this? I mean, what about this change what we've experienced here in the last few years? There's been a lot of talk about, it obviously isn't the same. Not when you have, recruiting classes of, say, 24 kids signing in December, and then it sort of has this leftover effect going into February. But with that being said, as we talked about in the opening segment, there's still some important pieces for programs like Alabama to try to put together here late.
There are. I wonder at some point if the, look at all the coaching changes that have taken place, whether head coaches or assistant coaches, since December. And I wonder if the pendulum's ever going to swing back to kids. Waiting until February to see who their coach is going to be, whether they're head coach or their position coach. That's one argument for the late period. As long as I think though the main thing to watch, and this has always been true of signing. It's funny, I talked to Tyler Watts about this last night. The phenomenon that we know as National Signing Day. It's always, people kept up with it. People kept up with it as far back as the 70s. But it's really become an industry, and it's driven by social media. As long as social media treats the December, ESPN has the Signing Day show and so forth, and they have one in February too. But as long as they do that in December, then December's going to be a big signing day. If ESPN said we're not going to do any commitment announcements in December, you'd see a lot of kids wait until February.
Yeah. You think you talked about, how it might swing back to kids waiting. You think that's especially true for the quarterback position, because of what we've seen?
I would say probably yes, Travis, but the flip side of that is they commit so early now.
Yeah.
Most of the top quarterbacks are already committed. Alabama had a decommitment last night from Carson Beck down at Mandarin High School in Florida. And it's not like you say how that'll turn out. Who knows? We're still a year away, almost from another signing day, a 2020 signing day. But you can't just automatically say, well, it's Alabama, they'll just go get a kid that's better. Well, maybe so, maybe not. But a lot of the kids that are higher in the rankings, and I think Carson's rankings will go up, but a lot of kids that are higher in the rankings, they're already committed. They've already looked at quarterback depth charts, which is probably the most important thing in quarterback recruiting, and they've made their decision. You can try and flip a kid, or I'm sure Alabama will continue to recruit Carson, and there's some other good players. The quarterback at Hoover's a good player. But, first of all, I think when you've had Tua and you get spoiled, guys who runner-up in the Heisman Trophy race, it's hard to go back and say, well, we'll find a game manager somewhere, and that's not an knock. That's not. AJ was outstanding. If you could find AJ McCarron every year, you'd be fine. But it's tough to go back and say, well, we'll take a couple of in-state kids and they can manage and we'll be fine. Alabama's a national player, and the fan base, and probably Nick Saban, if truth be told, would like to have a NFL type quarterback, NFL level quarterback, even if he doesn't play. Used to say, an NFL style quarterback with Mahomes and Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson. What is an NFL-style quarterback anymore?
It's a good point. And something else with these quarterbacks, too, not just the coaching changes, but the grad transfers. So much happens in the month of January now between coaching changes, but also if I'm one of these top quarterbacks, I want to see where all the quarterbacks are going to settle when the spring semester starts, wouldn't you? I mean, I don't really understand why a especially an elite quarterback, a top 5 type quarterback would be in such a hurry to commit with everything that can happen now between the end of the college football season and the traditional signing date. Why would these guys continue to commit as early as you talked about?
Well, there's a variety of reasons. My contention would be if you're, let me use somebody that's not a Alabama recruit, but if you're a top 5 runner, so you're John Emery, who signed with LSU. Mm-hmm. If you're a top 25, top 40, top 50 recruit, I wouldn't sign at all. My scholarship's going to be there. I'm not worried about it. So I wouldn't sign a binding national letter at all. I've always been that way. If I were Jadeveon Clowney, I just wouldn't sign a letter. And if South Carolina didn't want to admit me, I'd go somewhere else. But I think kids like the security. They like the being part of the hoopla, and I think coaches. I hate to use the word pressure, but I think obviously coaches stress to them how important it is for them to get the signing class done and get rolling, and how they can help recruit. And in several cases, guys come into school early. That's part of it too. So there are a variety of reasons, but I would, if I felt like I was going to be the 25th guy in Alabama's class and I better get my spot locked up, I'd probably sign a national letter. But if I were 1, 2, 3 top 25 guy in the country, I wouldn't sign one.
No way. Absolutely not. Not with the coaching changes now after the early signing period. And again, I'd want to see exactly who's enrolled where for the spring semester before I'd make that kind of decision, especially with quarterbacks playing so early, so many true freshman quarterbacks now that are not just seeing the field, they're starting. What about some past flips of note? We're talking flips of note in college football recruiting. What are one or two maybe that stand out to you in the past? We've hit on Cyrus Kwanjo. We've talked about Reuben Foster. But man, just here in the last few years, you look at Jake Fromm, you look at some of these other guys and how much it's sort of changed the landscape of the game, I guess.
Yeah, there are early flips, and then there are signing day. Cyrus was a signing day flip, or really a post signing day flip, which those are more rare, but certainly more high profile. You may see one or two tomorrow. I think that's very possible with Alabama's class in both directions. So, trying to think of some notable guys that were committed. Obviously, T.J. Yeldon, who was an Auburn commitment, and his flip to Alabama was a big deal in the Mobile area, and in quote unquote recruiting. But T.J. was, Alabama flipped several like that. Reuben, as you say, Cyrus, T.J. Yeldon. I'm trying to think of some national guys who were committed somewhere and then changed their mind and went somewhere else. But
we talked about Marcus Stroud, if you recall, back in the 90s, I guess it was. Right around the 2000, I guess. Marcus Stroud was a pretty big deal. The defensive lineman going from Florida to Georgia, kind of a regional kid though, so that wasn't that impactful. We've gotten some input on a lot of other guys too, but there's also those that fly under the radar, right, Cecil? I mean, there's flips that when they went down, they didn't get that much attention, but what about Quentin Williams going from Auburn to Alabama? Absolutely. In retrospect now?
Absolutely. He was headed to Auburn at one point. So, that can happen. Now, some kids are just what I like to call serial committers. They've committed on every trip, So are they really flipping, or are they just telling people what they want to hear? That's part of it. It's there have been some, a guy who didn't pan out, and I'm not knocking the guy, but I think Brent Callaway committed at one of the All-Star games. Then flipped. I think he committed to Alabama, then flipped to Auburn, and then committed back. Ended up signing with Alabama.
Yeah, you're right.
So, it's been there've been a few, and they're all, the harder it gets. It's like you say, and it tends to be rivals. It tends to be Florida and Florida State, like Dante Fowler. I think he was at Florida State and then Florida.
Right.
So Dalvin Cook, I think he was Florida and then Florida State at one point. So I think there's Michigan to Ohio State. Those are the ones that really sting the fan base. Those are the ones that just hurt. They just hurt. So not only are you getting him, whether it's Matt Elam, I think was one. I'm trying to remember the Florida States better than I would. But
yeah, there was a time there when Spurrier, Bowden, and Miami had it going too. You talk about some rivalries on the recruiting trail. I mean, you had guys like Fred Taylor coming out down in South Florida. It was, there were some heavyweight battles in the 90s between those Florida schools.
There were. Dalvin Cook's one I remember. I think Dalvin had originally committed to Clemson, and then committed to Florida, and then flipped to Florida State. And one thing I always think about that is, how would Florida's 14, 15, 16 seasons have been different had they had a Dalvin Cook? So they can matter. They can be. They can be, and people use them. There's a good chance, and I don't think I'm breaking news here. There's a good chance that a defensive back that's been committed to Alabama will flip to LSU tomorrow.
Christian Williams.
And how big a deal that'll be depends, and I'm sure he's a good player, and LSU will be getting a good player if that's what happens. But they'll also be getting we went into Alabama and got one, flipped him, took him away, and people do that, and that's what, when Ed hits the rubber chicken circuit or the rubber gumbo circuit, I guess it is in Louisiana. He can tell the alums that's what they like to hear. So that's part of it. There's a little bit of gamesmanship involved, and that is not to say that Christian Williams is not a good player, because I'm certain that he is.
Talking with Cecil Hurt of the Tuscaloosa News and TideSports.com on a Tuesday edition of Southern Fried Sports, presented by Carty and Lloyd, attorneys at law, and Mercedes-Benz of Tuscaloosa. Now, Cecil, you and we go back pre-internet era with this recruiting coverage stuff. We've both been in that arena. So with that, give us some recollections from the pre-internet era. Maybe guys like Cornelius Bennett, Bo Jackson, guys whose recruitments were almost legendary, or were legendary, especially when you consider, again, what we just talked about, the in-state institutions heavily vying for their services.
Yeah, first of all, way back, like with Bo, the general assumption, probably up to his junior year, was that Bo, who was 50 miles up the road in McCalla, was going to go to Alabama. He didn't commit, so he wasn't a flip. But Auburn got in there and changed his mind. And Bo was. This is how astute I am, Travis. Bo played against Brookwood. McAdory played Brookwood, and I went and I saw the game. Covered the game, high school game. I think I covered it. I was there. And I came out and I was like, man, he is amazing. That kid from McAdory, he's going to be the best linebacker in college football. Because that's really, he played both ways in McAdory, at least some, when they had to have him. And you can imagine what kind of linebacker Bo would have been.
Oof.
Lenny Patrick was one who, first of all, you had to see Lenny in high school to appreciate what a great running back he was. And then Lenny had Alabama and Auburn and USC and all of those involved. Now, obviously, there have been recruiting battles back, Pat Sullivan and Johnny Musso. And so that the change from that era is almost exclusively up until the 80s. We're talking about Alabama versus Auburn. Occasionally Alabama, Tennessee, or Alabama, LSU, but people really kept up with where the in-state kids were going and who was winning the state, and that was one of Pat Dye's big things when he came in, was that he was going to, and as Coach Bryant got older, was that Pat was going to control the state and still recruit in Georgia the way Auburn traditionally has. So. That part of it has changed. You rarely. I think the last absolute under the radar guy that signed with Alabama that wasn't in any services, wasn't or very few, and his commitment actually got broken by the newspaper in San Antonio, was Eric Anders. I don't think you'll ever see that again. That was partly, in the Shula era, the times were different and recruiting was a little different, and Alabama was not recruiting the way Nick Saban has. But they were getting some good players, and Eric Anders is a good player. But that name came completely out of the blue, and he told the San Antonio Express that he was coming. You don't ever see that anymore.
I remember that one going down and thinking, is this a walk-on deal?
Yeah, people were asking me, is this a walk-on? Is this kid walking on?
And it wasn't. In fact, Eric Anders, interestingly enough, a guy, when you talk about critical factors, Nick Saban probably would have had zero interest in, but ended up doing some really big things for Alabama, specifically in the national championship game against Texas.
Absolutely. So, credit to whoever evaluated him. Javi Arenas, same thing.
Yeah, Javi Arenas is the same way. Absolutely.
And now that doesn't mean, Josh Jacobs was almost that way. Josh was on some people's radar, but nobody was ever sitting around even 4 or 5 years ago saying, and this is with the expectation that Alabama is going to recruit really, really well. But if you had looked at their recruiting class and said, well, the two guys that are definitely out early and definite first-rounders are Quentin Williams and Josh Jacobs, I don't know how many people would have bought that.
Not many a few years back.
But it goes the other way, too. If you had said with last year's class, if you had said, well, the guy who's definitely out early and going to be is Minkah Fitzpatrick, you just said, yeah, that makes sense. Julio, I don't know any human who ever lived who thought Julio would play 4 years of college football.
Probably only needed one at the most, Julio. Hey, as we get out of here,
probably as close to a one and done as I have ever seen in college football.
Absolutely. As we get out of here, got to ask you about some hoops. Bracketology with Joe Lenardi of ESPN.com today has Alabama as a last four in as an 11 seed that would take on St. John's in one of those first four games, I guess.
Beautiful
this
date.
week. What's that? Oh, yeah.
Beautiful
Dayton,
date.
Absolutely. A little Dayton, Ohio for you there in that first four. So Georgia tomorrow night, Coleman Coliseum. Cecil, Vanderbilt on the road over the weekend. Looks like a doable week for Avery Johnson's team.
It does. First of all, you need to win your home game. I've never, you need to win your home game. Good teams do. So there's that. I'm so cautious about. People get so wrapped up. Well, you know, this is it. This is a maker. No, it's not. Today's the 5th of February, and it's not entirely determined by your outcome on the 5th of February. You are judged in the middle of March against 352 other teams. You know, there's so much more that goes into it than, oh, well, they won this one or they lost that one. People want to go back and particularize. Well, you know, I've got people say, well, they lost 3 games they shouldn't have lost. And if they had those 3 games, they'd be in. Do you know how many teams in America you can say you can take 3 losses and turn them into wins and put them in the tournament? You know, that's I mean, even one is, you know, you're changing the year. If you start talking about, well, if they just won those 3, everybody can say that. Everybody in the entire country can, you know, unless they're at that level of being already in. And I understand that's the level Alabama fans want to be in. But yes, winning is better than losing. Absolutely, no question about it. Every time you play, but it all goes into a resume that will be judged in March. You know, it's not, oh, they, you know, say they lose, then say that LSU comes in here and they beat LSU, you know, and Auburn comes in here and they beat Auburn. You know, you got to let those things play out a little bit. But with that said, yeah, I'm an absolute advocate. You need to win all your home games, and those road games. That, you know, they had their chances of winning at Auburn were the same as anybody else in the league. Kentucky went down there and won, and credit to them, but that's a tough place to go and win. So when somebody, as they did at Missouri, when you have a chance on the road, and I think Vanderbilt this year, despite Alabama's history in that arena, is a chance. You need to take advantage of that chance.
There you go. Cecil Hurt of the Tuscaloosa News and Tidesports.com. As always, Cecil, really appreciate you joining us here on the program. Enjoy the sequel to signing day, I guess, tomorrow as it plays out. I look forward to catching up with you real soon.
2.0, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cecil. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.